Hello, and welcome back to Dev Game Club, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers look at games from the past to discuss their relevance and impact today. I'm Brett Douville, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, a man who fondly remembers a train trip he took just before world events overtook him.
Tim Longo.
Hello.
I do like the train. We're doing a little bit of time traveling today. We have a special guest on. As Brett's intro is maybe alluding to. So I will jump right in and introduce Jordan Mechner, who needs no introduction, but here goes anyway. I wrote one because we want to do that as we start off. So for nearly, or really for 40 years, to be honest, as is a surprising number, for any guest that we've had on the podcast, Jordan has been creating and trailblazing in video games and beyond, going back as far as 1984, where he began work on Karateka. During his early years in game development, Jordan wore all of the hats, from programming to designing to writing and more. And from there, he went on to create Prince of Persia, as everyone knows, and we talked about on the podcast and played. Arguably one of the most important video games in video game history, has continued to innovate and push the boundaries of what is possible in games. After moving through many releases of Prince of Persia and then on to Prince of Persia 2, he chose to take an even bigger turn in 1993 to innovate in adventure games with The Last Express, which also involved the creation of a new studio, Smoking Car Productions. The Last Express is also considered one of the most unique and influential adventure games and interactive narrative of all time, due to its unique approach in production, which hopefully we'll get to talk about. Jordan is also a filmmaker, having worked on various projects, including the film adaptation of Prince of Persia for Disney as screenwriter, something nearly no developer has ever been able to do in our history, which is something that is worth mentioning. And Jordan is also a writer and artist and graphic novelist, having published many books, as well as recently releasing replay Memoir of an Uprooted Family. Jordan has also been nominated and awarded various honors throughout the years, including the DGC Pioneer Award in 2017. And I could go on, but we're not here to talk, listen to me. We're here to talk to Jordan. So Jordan, thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me. And what was this train trip that you took?
Oh, Brett,
well, we started in Paris. No, we always do intros that are based on the games that we're discussing. So in that case, I'm discussing The Last Express. So Tim did not actually recently. Yeah, we played it a few months ago on the cast, and as I said, we kind of look at older games and talk about their impact. And that is one that, at the time, unfortunately, with a lot of other people, we had missed or maybe played a little of. We were working at or about to work at LucasArts at the time, and different adventure game studio. But it was a remarkable game to play. Even at this late date, I actually played it a bit on its iPad release, which is maybe 10 years ago. I don't remember exactly when that came out.
Yeah,
but,
that sounds about right.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I went to play it on the iPad again, and it is not corrected for time. So everything was playing very fast. So it was a little hard to play. So I dug it out on a PC. Anyway.
Yeah, well, and funny small story. I actually took a train trip on my honeymoon, on our honeymoon. So I am a fan of trains, but not in pre-World War I. So Jordan, one of the ways we like to begin, as our listeners often like to hear, because we're game development centric, as opposed to journalistic or something like that, we like to kind of get into the weeds on things as much as we have time for. Even though your book has just come out, Replay, which probably explains all of this and the question I'm about to ask, and also you've done many great talks and postmortems and stuff, so people have access to that stuff over the years. But how, the proverbial question of how did it all begin? Like what drew you in? So maybe it's a little bit of a quick verbal summary of what the book, probably covers in the early chapters. But how did you get into games, and why did you get into games?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And the graphic novel does cover it, but really it covers it in two panels. You know, in one, in one panel it's 1976, and I'm 10 years old, and I'm drawing caricatures at a local fair, that was kind of what I did as a kid before computers and the Apple II came along. Really, Space Invaders in 1978 was the first game that I played in an arcade that kind of made me wake up and say, "Whoa, this is really super cool." And then the Apple computer, which arrived at the same time, kind of just captivated me with the incredible power of being able to program a game, and then play it, and then have my friends play the game that I just made.
Mm.
Because all through my childhood, I was really all about making stuff, drawing comics, writing stories, making little Super 8 movies. But of course, everything I made seemed like a kid had made it, which,
Mm-hmm.
and then I loved Disney movies and, Hitchcock, movies and the comics by my favorite authors. And I could, see that what I was doing wasn't quite at that level. But then the Apple II was so new that the games that were inspiring me had also been done by people who were also young and had just kind of started doing it a couple of years ago. So I felt like it might be possible to catch up. And I spent the years in high school and then through college programming increasingly ambitious Apple II games with kind of this dream of getting a game published.
Amazing.
Yeah.
It's like I wasn't quite at the level of some of the best film art ever made is quite a humble statement. Here I was a kid and I couldn't quite match Hitchcock, but I thought maybe if I turned to a new medium, I had a chance. I love it.
Yeah, no, I definitely, like from the age of 6, I always had these grandiose aspirations. I would shoot silent films with one Super 8 camera, with casting my friends in all the roles. And then I was just, so disappointed by the production values, at the end.
Oh, amazing. So your quality, yeah, I mean, your eye for striving for quality was very early in life, which is a great way to begin, your career in a way. And the caricature, I feel like maybe we talked about it, or I remember you talking about it somewhere else. Starting out drawing caricatures as a kid, which obviously somewhat segues nicely into the rotoscoping games and sort of your approach to how much art and animation and film impacted the way that you ended up choosing to develop some of those early games. So I mean, the natural, I guess, next question and segue is those early drawings or sketches I think you've released or of prints and even Karateka, and also the rotoscoping specifically, and the concept of using filming techniques and animation techniques to motion match, essentially, before we knew what motion matching was, I guess. And how did that lead into games? Was it sort of your artistic background that drew you to connect the two?
Well, I mean, it was really kind of an improvisation out of necessity. The fact that I could, that I'd done comics and that I kind of knew how to draw, at the, 13-year-old level was really useful for me in making my first games, because in those days, programmers, we did all of our own art and
Mm-hmm.
animation as well, along with sound design, or what passed for sound design. So in doing the graphics for my early games, I was able to use my drawing skills, such as they were, to try to make the games look better. But when it came to animation, there was a limit to what I could do, and it was with my first published game, Karateka, that I had the idea of doing a game that would have fairly large, well animated characters on the screen. Not just little triangles, like a spaceship and asteroids, with a sort of abstract pixel graphics, but to really try to have a human character that would look human and that would move like a person. But when I tried to animate these characters, the animation just didn't look as smooth and as fluid and as lifelike as I wanted it to. So the solution that I found was rotoscoping. It was to film an actor, or actually my mom's karate teacher, with a Super 8 camera, doing all of the punches and kicks and moves. And then I filmed my dad running and climbing the cliff, actually climbing up onto the hood of our family car in front, in the woods in front of our house. And rotoscoping is basically just a fancy word for tracing each frame to get the silhouette of the filmed character, and then reproducing those frames as animation, frame by frame. It's a technique that was used, going back to silent film in the 1920s and 30s, by early animators, and you can't really tell that animation was rotoscoped, but it just kind of gives you like a shortcut to getting the right timing and the right, very human, very specific movements. And so it worked wonderfully for Karateka, and I think it was a big reason that game, made the impact that it did. It was published in 1984, and it was in my last year of college. And then after university, I went and I did another game using rotoscoping, Prince of Persia, and for this I used VHS rather than Super 8, because this home video technology had kind of come into the home in the years between 1982 and 1985. So I used a VHS camera and filmed my brother David, who was 15 years old at the time, running and jumping and climbing and doing all the movements that I would need for Prince of Persia. And we did that in the parking lot across the street from our high school in Chappaqua, New York. And then the rotoscope process from Super 8 involved kind of going from digital to analog, actually taking photographs of the video screen with a 35 millimeter film camera, getting the film developed, and then going over each printed snapshot with a Sharpie and whiteout to get the silhouette, and then digitizing that into the computer to reconstruct it one frame at a time. So it was kind of a very handcraft, time-consuming way of doing it, but again, it worked really well. And seeing that sprite, the Prince of Persia character, running and jumping across the screen, even with that limited resolution, I could recognize, my brother David's kind of personality, his little awkward movement, his, the fact that he was, not a trained athlete or a stunt person, but just like a, regular kid trying to climb, something that wasn't that easy to climb. It really came across in the game, and I think gave it a lot of its charm.
Yeah, you must have been familiar with like Thief of Baghdad or something like that. I think of the silhouettes and the movement in that film. It's also just a kid, is my recollection. I haven't seen it in a long time.
Thief of Baghdad, the 1940 Technicolor movie. Yeah, Sabu played the kid, and then there was Conrad Veidt played the evil vizier Jafar.
Right.
That was. Obviously a direct inspiration for the storyline of Prince of Persia, with the princess and, locked in her room with the hourglass. And I even took the name Jafar for the villain, which of course had come from the 1001 Nights tales to begin with.
Did you know about rotoscoping as a film technique, I guess, prior to that? Was that, or was it something you kind of came up with? You were like, well, if I took pictures, I could trace it, Did you kind of already know about the technique?
I was taking silent film classes in college. I was majoring in psychology, but I was really interested in film. I'd always wanted to make movies or write movies somehow. And so I was kind of trying to keep my hand in and continue learning about filmmaking alongside making these video games. So that silent film study actually influenced Karateka in a lot of ways, not just the rotoscoping, but also the idea of using cross-cutting, the kind of the horizontal wipes as transitions, because I kind of had the idea that video games, computer games were in their infancy in much the way that silent film had been, 100 years earlier. And so looking at those early films was kind of inspiring, because you could see the first film that used cross-cutting and the first films that used a close-up, rather than just having the camera on a tripod and filming the action continuously, that, dynamic cutting could become part of the cinematic language. And so, of course, 5 years later, all films were doing cutting and using camera moves, and it just seemed completely natural. But for video games, there were all these things that hadn't yet been tried, and so in Karateka, I got to try them out and find out for almost for the first time if they were going to work. And cross-cutting was one of those. The idea of cutting from the main character, the playable character who you're controlling with a joystick or the keyboard, and then cutting away to one of the enemies who's running towards you. So the question was, would that be disorienting for the player? Would it be frustrating? Like, wait, where did my character go? And in fact, it worked fine, just as it had worked fine in cinema. But it was exciting to be able to test these things out, and discover whether they would work or not.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier filming your brother, which of course is a bit of an infamous story too, and I had forgotten how old he was until you mentioned it there too. But such a fun. Your point about the characterization of the prince, I think, and the sort of groundedness of him and authenticity. To your point that your brother wasn't a trained stunt actor or anything, but the prince. Is exerting himself, and there's effort there, which at the time, I remember playing Prince as a youngster myself before I was a game developer. And I think I talked about this on the series when we played the game, just blowing my mind as far as how much fidelity and authenticity, like I said, you get in that game. And because, like you said, it was such a trailblazing moment for games because everyone at the time was trying to figure it out, especially for home use. That authenticity that you're getting from this, I know it was, necessity is the mother of invention kind of situation for you. And you mentioned that, in your early test for it, you felt like you probably had something, but when was the moment that you realized that this was a pretty significant discovery, even though it was based on something, that you felt like you needed to do because of your animation, skills? So like, what was that feeling? I don't know. It's a little bit of a vague, sort of touchy feely kind of question, but what was that feeling like when you started to see all that hard work on screen?
Well, it's a question I can answer with more confidence because I actually kept a journal at the time, starting in college when I was making
Amazing.
Karateka. So, I'm sure I would remember it anyway, but I can actually go back and read what I wrote in my journal and see how, sort of tense I was waiting for the film to come back, and be developed, and then to see what the result of the process would be and wondering if it would work or if I just wasted a week. And so I wrote in my journal just how excited I was when I saw the character moving across the screen and, the movement was there. It was just one of those wonderful, excited, eureka moments. Like, and I wasn't thinking of it as a discovery, or anything like that. It was just like, okay, this works. I can make the
Right.
game. It's giving me what I need, to bring this game into being, the way that I, want it to be.
Right.
And with Prince of Persia a few years later, I had more confidence that it would work because it had worked once. But this was a new version of the process, and there was a lot more different kinds of movements with the running, the jumping, the ways that all these movements had to chain together for Prince of Persia was a lot more. There were more unknowns than there had been for Karateka, which was kind of a very simple, moving left to right, running and fighting game. So I think there was another moment like that with Prince of Persia to just see how believable and engaging the character was and how all these movements actually did fit together, and you couldn't really see the splices, like you really believed that the character was doing those things. And that's I think it's amazing how our mind fills in the gaps, and the fact that the graphics were so low resolution compared to today's games, today's platforms, wasn't actually a disadvantage. In a way, it made it possible, because when a character's face is just 4 pixels square, our imagination fills in the rest, and so we forgive the differences. Whereas when you have a really high resolution, photorealistic animated character, like as we can easily do today, then that actually creates a new challenge in that anything that's just slightly off puts you into an uncanny valley where this illusion of reality is kind of broken, and then you can't get it back. So I think that's one reason that these older games with lower resolution, with on these ancient platforms, kind of burn themselves so deeply, into our hearts and into our memories, because our imagination brought you know so much to it that wasn't actually on the screen. Our brain completed the picture, so it's almost like as players we kind of became co-creators of those games.
Yeah. No, that's definitely an excellent point. I think we talked about it probably some as well, and you just mentioned the transitions between each of the sort of core animations. And I mean, we probably don't have time to get into the super details about how you're able to splice those together so seamlessly. But to your point, it really didn't matter because the core animations, say, for instance, the jump or the grab or hang or something, were so good and so effective. You didn't need if there was a pop or a snap or something, or a missed frame in between two transitions, even though usually there wasn't. Like you said, I definitely, people don't notice, they fill in the gaps, and it was just such a unique and interesting, because as a player, I was playing whatever Sierra games or some of the other game, LucasArts games, some of the other games are out and around that time that were using different, more hand animated techniques. And it just felt like, kind of like a missing link, even though rotoscoping, especially the specific technique that you used, wasn't, we do motion capture today, we do motion matching today, and things like that. So there's some influence there, of course, but it was like you said, because of the platform and the medium, it was that kind of a right place, right time for what we needed at that time, that then would influence our, I think, goals into the future about how to present fluidity, to the player. So yeah, it's just it's great that you kept a journal too, by the way, and then you can
Yeah,
go and
he's
reference
he's
that.
you can read those along with the
Oh
new
yeah,
memoir.
that's
They're
right.
they're available. I've read the Karateka one, and I don't remember reading the Prince of Persia one. Um, they're super. They're great. I mean, it kind of took me back when I read it to like when I was first programming for games, and just like the moments of excitement or frustrations or whatever. I'm curious, Jordan, about since you've then moved with rotoscoping or something very similar, maybe you can describe the differences in the process. But with the Last Express, you had way more fidelity. Still not anywhere near where we are today, but where were the challenges there? Because that still also is very readable and believable, but not, but much higher fidelity than certainly than Karateka or even Prince of Persia, obviously.
Yeah, for the Last Express, we also used rotoscoping, but in a very different way. Before I talk about Last Express, I want to mention when you started, your question was originally about caricaturing, and I think there's actually a link here because, what I was doing, as a caricaturist, before I started programming, was to try to find a way to capture a
Mm.
likeness, and this was, it's like a fairground where people would come and they'd pay $5 and sit down, and I would try to draw a caricature that they would take home and be happy because, so that their friends and family would say, "Oh yeah, man, that really looks like you." Like
Hmm.
that was the goal, to have a drawing that, even though it's like very simple and just a few lines, that the people who know the person would say, "Absolutely, you caught him." And
Yeah, that essence, kind of, right, of like it's not meant to be photorealistic, but that's still recognizable.
yeah, right. These weren't like detailed portraits with with shading and so forth, which are are also awesome. But I was really modeling my style after the artists that I admired in Mad Magazine and things like that. And
Hmm.
Al Hirschfeld was an amazing caricaturist, for the New York Times, and I would just look at these drawings like, how can that how can that look like Frank Sinatra? It's like it's just these, it's completely exaggerated. It's just a few lines, and yet instantly you recognize it's him. Like that magic really fascinated me, and I sort of came back to that recently with Replay, with this graphic novel, because there I drew all the characters from my own life story. So of course, my dad, my brother, my colleagues at Broderbund, that I was, you know, because I described the making of Prince of Persia and The Last Express, and it's really it's a multi-generational story in which I had to draw the people that I know best, at various stages of their life. So it was really important to me that they be recognizable, even though for a reader it might be, you see a guy, okay, you accept that he's my dad, but I really wanted, like, everybody who knows my dad to look at that and laugh and say, yeah, that's totally him. That his gestures, the way that he puts on his glasses when he wants to look at something closely, and I think to do that kind of caricature or to do rotoscoping for a game, like you have to really sort of find the essence of how somebody expresses their character, in movement. And that's very individual, because it's easy to draw somebody correctly, and these days, like with the tools that we have, it's so easy to say, give me a run cycle, give me a character that jumps and climbs, and you can also get stunt people who will do that perfectly with total efficiency. But it's the inefficiency, and it's the the individual things that people do that nobody else does that make them recognizable. So that's kind of, for me, that's part of the magic of rotoscoping, is that it captures the quirks that you wouldn't think of, even if you're a really good trained artist or animator. When you look at like an actual person doing it, there's always something that surprises you. And by the way, drawing is something that I did as a kid, but I pretty much stopped doing it for 30 years, because all through the time that I was making Karateka, Prince of Persia, The Last Express, I was only drawing to do storyboards, to communicate with the team, to kind of develop my ideas. And if you read my published Prince of Persia journals, the illustrated edition includes a lot of sketches, and you can see they're not good. I mean, I'm not trying to make art. I'm not trying to make sketches that will, stand on their own or that anybody would want to frame and look at. It's really just, they're just working sketches. I didn't create finished art assets, for any of my games after, not after the animation and the graphics for Prince of Persia on the Apple II. After that, I kind of stepped back, both from programming and from art and animation, and I just worked in a kind of a more directorial role with teams where I had, real programmers and real artists and animators, who could, for whom that was really their, that was their specialty. They studied it. They were devoting all of their, talent and energy to mastering that aspect of the craft. And so, I was happy, to have others do that who could do it better than I could. But
takes a team.
Exactly, yeah. And the teams got bigger, of course. From like the PC version of Prince of Persia was probably the first team project that I did, because it was a small Broderbund team of about 5 people doing what basically amounted to a remaster of the Apple II version, but with better graphics and with real digitized sound effects, like the clashing blades and the springing spikes, that everybody remembers probably is from the PC version. And then the music that my dad had composed for the Apple II, he reorchestrated with multiple instruments and real harmony, whereas on the Apple II we could only play these kind of series of beeps to create an arpeggio and suggest a harmony, but we couldn't really play chords. So I worked with a team on that 1990 PC version of Prince of Persia, which came out a few months after the Apple, and then the teams just got bigger and bigger with Prince of Persia 2 and then The Last Express. But I came back to drawing really about 15 years ago, at first as a hobby. I just started sketching from life, filling sketchbooks with drawings of, people that I saw around me in cafes. I sketched on the Prince of Persia movie set in Morocco. It was because there was all these incredible things, happening around me, these sets and the actors and horses, camels, and the film equipment. I just wanted to draw it, so I drew that in my sketchbook, and then when I was at the airport, if I had an hour before my flight, I would just draw the people sitting in the lounge, and I found that really almost like a meditative practice, and it really brought me back to the pleasure of drawing that I had as a kid, and then the challenge of trying to capture people's attitudes, because 10 people sitting in an airport with their luggage, all 10 of them are sitting in a different way. So if you say, draw a person sitting in an airport with luggage, whatever, I can draw it. But then when you're drawing actually what you see in front of you, there's always something just wonderful that surprises you, and that's caricature, and that's something that in drawing Replay, the graphic novel, I really took pleasure in kind of revisiting all these different periods of my life, and of course, and then of my dad's life and my dad's childhood, because it's a multi-generational story, and trying to draw them in ways that were recognizable and that would really, some with a pretty simple, clean line, and without trying to be photorealistic, would really evoke the atmosphere and the feeling, of those moments.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it does. I don't know your father, but I have this sense of him through his life, very much from that story. And of course, I've never met you either in person, so I get that sense as well. It's very sort of, as you say, clean, like bande dessinée style. So European comics, French comics, more so than sort of American, comic books with which our audience might be more familiar. Really lovely style. How long did that take? Out of curiosity, it's like 300 and, I don't know, 15 pages, something like that.
Yeah, 320. Yeah, Replay took me about 3 years to write and draw.
Wow.
And that was pretty much full time. Yeah. So
I was going to say too. I don't. It also reminds me a little bit of, if you're familiar with Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud, which is sort of an infamous graphic novel about the breakdown of how comics worked and how graphic novels work, and that I think there's some similarities in style there, and like you said, economical caricature of delivering information about a certain frame. I mean, to pull it before you hit Last Express question, but just to pull on this, because I love this thread, by the way, pull on this thread a little bit. Especially in early game design, feedback and caricature and delivering the information you need to the player about what the game is trying to tell you is an art form, because you had, like you said, so little of the medium to do that with. So I think it's a really excellent point you're bringing up in topic and takeaway for me as far as what caricature means to delivering information, even, right? Like you said, attitude or what have you. The people in the airport with luggage is a great example. It's like, that you're giving information to the viewer of each of those different people sitting on the bench with their luggage, and you're delivering a different story with each of them. And that's what you're trying to do with good feedback in game design too. Like, how does that jump? What is the attitude of that jump? How far can I jump? How much, when do I grab the ledge, et cetera, et cetera. All of that's important for successful game feedback too.
And that's actually a great segue back into the Last Express. You mentioned Understanding Comics. Well, it was in the early days of starting to make the Last Express that I read that book, Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, and
that makes sense.
I think the page that springs to mind, and maybe that's the one you were thinking of, is where he shows a series of drawings going from a photograph to a photorealistic cartoon to kind of more simplified until he ends up with just the a circle with two dots, the smiley face, the universal happy face button. And his point is that the more abstract and simplified, the more universal that face becomes.
Yes.
And thus the easier to identify with. And that's really the reason that I wanted to use rotoscoping for the Last Express, because I was kind of like asking myself the question of how games were going to adapt to this higher resolution, the new technology, which in 1993, it was only 4 years after the first Prince of Persia, but the technology had, just taken off. There were obviously, the machines were more powerful, but you could now do CD-ROM digitized video, and there were games that would actually play back little bits of video in the game, and so. Look, and then there was Myst, which came out in 1993, sort of the year that I was trying to figure out like what I wanted to do next. And I was blown away by the beauty of these 3D renders, which was a technology that had, it was new at the time. Even movies didn't use CGI graphics yet. Special effects were still mostly done using the old analog ways and using the camera. So my concern was that in a game, if it was too realistic, that it would break the illusion of interactivity. That if you play back digitized video, on the screen, like you instantly know that you're no longer in the game. You're just watching something that's been recorded and is now being played back. You're seeing actors play back their lines. So, playing Prince of Persia in 2D, I can imagine that character is me, running and jumping and climbing on the screen. But if I'm watching a video, of a character doing that, it's like I might as well put down the joystick. I feel like whatever controls I'm doing, like at best, it's like I'm branching between different pre-recorded video segments. It's not quite the same feeling.
And like a Dragon's Lair or something.
Yeah.
Like that. Yeah.
Well, and Dragon's Lair is, it's a cartoon. It's beautifully animated. I mean, it looks, if you could really control that animated character, that would be amazing. But of course you can't. That you just have to press the button to branch. But with digitized video, it's like even your subconscious mind knows that that this couldn't possibly be interactive. So my thought with Last Express was that, by digitizing the characters and, using a rotoscope process that would turn the filmed movements, the filmed actors into something resembling a cartoon, like a sort of a comic book or bande dessinée character, that would enable the player to imagine that, sort of project ourselves into the action the way that we had for the old 2D games, because it wasn't photorealistic, and yet there was, I was going after the individual, the nuances of live actors that would be very difficult to get with hand animation. And whereas, of course, in Prince of Persia, the character is 40 pixels high, seen from a distance, always in profile, because that game is all about what movements are you doing. You're running. There's a gap. How big is the gap? Can you make the jump? Can you grab the ledge? It's physical. It's like an old Buster Keaton silent movie. It's the physical action. But in The Last Express, I wanted to have close-ups. I wanted to use the depth of the field to have, the game is played on a train in 1914, so you've got the details of the costumes and the background. It's this luxury express train. It's the Orient Express with all of the wonderful details of that train interior of the time. But then when a character walks towards you down the train corridor, you see them far away and you see them getting bigger and bigger in frame. And then when the character passes you, like when you pass someone in an actual train corridor, because it's your point of view, there's this kind of, you have to step aside, they step aside, and your eyes meet for a moment. And I wanted that to feel like, I wanted the player to have that uncanny feeling that they saw me, like that they're reacting to what I'm doing.
Well, you nailed it.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm so glad you brought that up, because that is like, I think it's one of the most impactful moments in the game for me every time I pass somebody.
I mean, it worked wonderfully, and it's the actors who nailed it. I mean, it was such a pleasure to film those corridor walks, with all of these different actors with different attitudes, and because they can look at you in a way that feels like disdainful or suspicious, or
tells you a lot about them.
Yeah, exactly. It's a chance for the actors to convey their character, like without speaking a word. But then, of course, they can also say, excuse me, in their own native language in various ways. And so that, the wonderful thing about that rotoscope process is that it actually captured the nuances of the facial expressions. Even like the blink of the eye, the lifting of the eyebrow. With just as much fidelity as it captured the running and jumping movements from Prince of Persia. So that worked really well. And for me, it also had a practical benefit, which was that it made those thousands of frames of animation very compressible. Because in 1993, the memory was a huge issue, and compressed video still takes up. Streaming it from a CD-ROM is just a nightmare, and it slows everything down. That's why those 90s games were so often kind of more clunky and like didn't have the speed and fluidity of the previous generation of games, because they had to be loading all of that data constantly from the disk, because it couldn't fit in RAM. But rotoscoping was compressed so efficiently, because these were basically line drawings with flat areas of solid color, that it enabled us to have a ton of animations that we could play back smoothly, and so the game is actually pretty fluid.
Oh, amazing. That's a great point. I'm sure Brett maybe brought that up when we played it, but that's a really, I mean, and your realization, observation, conclusion, whatever you want to say for what I guess I'll call the FMV movement at the time because of CD-ROM, because we did play Myst for the podcast, and we had was it Robin on?
Yeah, we had Robin.
We had Robin on. Um, uh, and Myst was definitely one of the ones to kick that off, but we haven't played, for instance, Seventh Guest or some of the others that were, or even from our past, Rebel Assault, which were, heavily leaning into FMV, full motion video, sections. But to your point, you know, there was always that, going back to your point about Uncanny Valley, of this, I'm watching a movie that in the middle of trying to play this game, and really I just have branching options, but it's not really interactive in the same sense. And I think with The Last of Us, and I think that's why FMV was never kind of my thing, though I did play those games back in the day, just because it's sort of like today where people are chasing photorealism all the time, right? With the next cutting edge, and video was like, felt like, oh, it's a real place, when it really kind of didn't ultimately feel that way because the interactivity wasn't there. The Last Express had this more moment to moment interactivity. And I guess that's, obviously what you're saying, where you're making decisions on the fly, but there's also this, even though it's not real time characters in a three-dimensional space, it gave me the sense of that, because you could, and again, I don't know, I assume this was, I want to ask you about this, but the structure of the game, because the train is the structure and the level design and the focus, the world design, it gave this great constraint, because all you could do was move up and down the train, right? Or into rooms, into cars or cabins. And so it forces this constraint, basically, to still have this sense of fluidity, even though it's video, it's rotoscoped video. So I don't know, was the structure of it, was it more that you wanted to tell an Orient Express story, or was the structure an important part for you?
Absolutely. I mean, the technology of the time, didn't allow for, say, creating an open world,
Right.
large environment like in GTA, where you can move around an entire city, and everywhere you go, there's people doing things. That just wasn't yet possible in 1993. So, one of the things that attracted me and the team about setting the game on a train is that it's such a confined space that it was actually possible to bring that space to life with great depth. It's, you've got 7 train cars, you can only walk up and down, and you can go into the compartments, and that's it. So within that small world, we could have, more than 30 characters, NPCs, all of the other passengers on the train, the crew members, the conductor, the waiters who work in the restaurant, and sort of set them all in motion so that they wouldn't just kind of show up and do a cameo, like in a traditional adventure game where, the forest has nobody in it, but then you walk into, one part of the forest and there's a blacksmith,
Mm-hmm.
working away, and he has a conversation with you, and he gives, he upgrades your sword or whatever, and then that's all there is to the blacksmith. That never felt real to me. That always felt really artificial. But to show the blacksmith go home to his family and what do they have for dinner, at that point you're in GTA territory. You're beyond what an early 90s game could do. But on the train, we actually could have all of the characters kind of moving all the time. So each character had their own what we called character logic. That is, they go to their compartment, they read a newspaper for an hour, and then they go to dinner. They have they order dinner, they sit down. You can eavesdrop on the conversation that they have, and then at a certain point, the family gets up, they go back to their compartment, and the kid leaves the compartment. He's running up and down the corridor, blowing a whistle, his mom comes out and yells at him. So you could have like every set of characters on the train have their own little mini dramas, and they sort of act as if they're actually the main character in their own life story. And so then as the player, you can interact with all of them, but so much of what they do is kind of optional. Like you won't see everything that all the characters can do in a single playthrough. But that feeling that there's stuff happening just around the corner, or just behind you, or in the next car, kind of gives it a lifelike feeling and an urgency that that sort of real-time feeling that I wanted to capture, and that was only possible because the train was such a constrained environment.
Yeah, it's like an Agatha Christie novel, except that Hercule Poirot isn't always going to be in the right place to overhear the conversation at the right time. He could be anywhere, and the sort of experience of the player is getting closer and closer to being Hercule Poirot by dint of sort of exploring the different parts of the train, at each time, basically, because you have the rewind mechanic. Actually, I guess I actually was playing two games simultaneously because I wanted to play a certain way in one and then go to the other one and try to see things I hadn't seen, because I had some experience with games like Deadline, and I guess, what was the other one called? The Witness, I think. Was
those Infocom text adventures. That's actually a great reference, and those actually were also part of the direct inspiration for The Last Express, because those were some of the first text adventures that I'd played where I actually did have the feeling that the characters were moving around, doing their own thing, and that if you can, a character would walk through the room and you can should I follow him and see where he goes, or should I stay in this room and hoping that this other character will show up and that I'll see, that'll tell me where they've hidden this object, and that's so that was text, of course, but part of the idea behind Last Express was to to do that graphically, and there was sort of, I guess you'd call it, an interactive theater piece called Sleep No More. I saw that a few years ago in New York, and that made me think of Last Express too, because there you're in a house, the audience, instead of sitting in your seats, you're kind of walking around, and you're invisible. Like the actors ignore you, but you can go into a room, and you can each room is a set, so you can sort of look at the objects. You're looking for clues. You can pick up somebody's journal or a scrap of paper that they've left on the table and see what they've written, and then every now and then, like an actor will, or a group of actors will pass by, and they're playing out a scene, and so that's exciting. It's like, oh, let's see what's happening. You can follow them, you can listen, and sometimes you have to choose like which actor you're going to follow, and it's there's just something really fascinating and magical about that. So Sleep No More made me think of what we were trying to do with The Last Express.
Yeah, good connection there. It's we at the end of a series, we do what we just call takeaways, and as we do the interviews too, there's always takeaways that we're taking out of those too, as things that you all say when we talk to you. And I think we, in our day-to-day jobs, of course, in development, and then on the podcast, we often talk about the importance of constraints and focus, and yes, there are the GTAs out there and the Assassin's Creeds or what have you, but I, as a designer, am always really appreciative of games that really do focus. And like you said, it allowed you to go deep instead of broad, and the train is such, I'm just hearing you talk about a little bit again, sort of like necessity being the mother of invention at the time, because you were seeing these games that were trying to maybe push a little bit beyond their means with the technology. Of course, everyone's trying to figure it out, but to be so disciplined to choose a train story. And like you said, like I was very surprised. I think both of us were very surprised about how clockwork the train felt. And like you said, if you just stand in the middle of the hallway, the train hallway or what have you, and don't move, the train is, everyone's doing their thing. People are coming and walking by you. And, if you just stand in the dining car, like conversations are happening. You leave the dining car, you can hear them muffled, a little bit further away. Like this sense of, like, I was just very surprised because I think, we played Sierra adventure games for the podcast as well, and LucasArts adventure game. And so we have good comparison points that we've discussed, and it just is unlike anything out there at the time, especially, but even to this day, it's just such a special way to think about, constraining that, because it, like you said, it allows you to to bring it back around to caricatures. I remember the characters in that game, because I'm terrible with names, so I won't remember the names, but I have their attitudes in my head.
The Austrian violinist spy, the German arms dealer.
Yeah, the German arms dealer. What's his name? I forget his name.
August Schmidt.
Yeah, Schmidt. Like,
what a
burned into
actor.
my brain. Yeah, I bet.
Yeah. I'm so glad that The Last Express is has kind of continued, and that it's once again playable for today's gamers on mobile and also in emulation. It's and I'm glad to see that it's surprisingly, although the technology, of course, it's clearly early 90s technology, the resolution and so forth. Somehow the game itself doesn't feel dated.
It holds up.
Whereas I think FMV games of the time,
nope. Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, I mean it's actually, I think, because you are caricaturing those actors, right? You can actually get a lot more out of their performances in a way, I think, than the FMV can, right? Because you're limited by budget, to whatever kind of actors you can get, and that's definitely clear in any of the FMV of the time. Like, oh, these are not, these are, I'm sure they're fine actors, if you see them performing, but when they're performing for FMV, it doesn't even work. So even at that level, even though it's way higher fidelity, they just don't hold up as real characters in a way that The Last Express totally does. Despite them being cartoonish.
We've really put a lot of effort into the writing, the construction of the story, the casting, and the performances. Both the physical acting and also the voice recording, which, by the way, were two separate things. We started by recording the voices. We did. You guys were in San Francisco or Bay Area at the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we recorded it at Zoetrope Studios at Coppola's.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
I mentioned that.
Studios, and had the actors come in, and we actually, we did it like like a radio play or like theater. We actually let the actors rehearse and find their characters and do a real performance, and then the actors who did the voices weren't necessarily the same actors who would do the physical performance, which was a silent film shoot against a blue screen. So that let us cast actors who were, first of all, of the correct nationality, so that it's not an American actor pretending to speak with an Austrian accent. It's actually an Austrian actor speaking English with her natural accent.
Amazing. You're trailblazing there too.
and also the actors that they often, when they're speaking among themselves, they speak in Serbo-Croatian or German or Russian, because there's no reason for them to be speaking English, if they're not speaking to the main character who's American. So that's what. So then there's two kinds of dialogue. There's dialogue that you can eavesdrop, which is it's not in English, so it might or might not be subtitled depending on whether or not the character is supposed to understand. And then you've got the face-to-face dialogue, and so all of that. There was just like hundreds of pages of recorded dialogue from all the characters. Some of it was improvised. Some of it, maybe you'll only hear it in one playthrough out of 10. But all of it kind of just deepens the universe.
Amazing. I did have a question about the languages, so you hit it there. But yeah, I think you're trailblazing there as far as casting actors, who have that as their native language, and also it's just a completely bold, and move as far as having conversations that make sense that the main character would not understand. It's just I just was flabbergasted at that choice. I mean, we're running out of time. I did want to sneak in.
Well, I had a question too.
You go.
Yeah. So, one of the things that I'm curious about, and this is kind of more of a wrap up question, I guess, but, you are, I mean, we say graphic novel, but it's really a graphic memoir. So you're a graphic memoirist. The games that we've played of yours are rooted in history. They may be fantastic, but, or stylized, but they're very, and one's very real in the case of the Orient Express. You haven't really made anything science fiction that I'm aware of. I maybe missed something, but why do you think that is? What's is that an early lifelong fascination? Tell me about your fascination with history.
Yeah, I mean, I think you know historical fiction and adventure fiction has always been like one of my favorites. I mean, even I think it's like Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Mm.
Had a historical setting. Many of the Hitchcock was one of my favorite filmmakers. Seven Samurai was one of my favorite films. I think my tastes just lean that way. Uh, I mean, I like science fiction as well. Nothing against it. I guess the closest I've come to working in science fiction was writing a screenplay adaptation of Fathom, a Michael Turner comic. But that's really you can't really call that science fiction. It's more like what if there were a race of undersea people. It's kind of like this lost civilization,
Mm.
which has been
Atlantis.
which has
Yeah.
been living alongside people in the ocean all of these years, and tried how to make that feel real. And that's a movie that never got made, but I did write the script. But yeah.
Well, I didn't mention in your intro, but you're a documentarian as well, award winning as well too. So yeah, I mean, there's always to Brett's point, you've always had that. I think no pun intended, lens on things, which is I think added for me. We've talked a lot about I think authenticity in this episode. I think it lends a sort of authenticity when you have even if it's fantastical historical lens, having that bit of groundedness in the history of it, I feel like has really made things stand out. To Brett's point.
Yeah, I think that's just sort of the way that my imagination leans. And Prince of Persia is fantasy, but for me, a big part of the appeal is that it's set in
Mm-hmm.
in a world that really did exist.
Mm-hmm.
Those fantastical tales of the Thousand and One Nights, Thief of Baghdad, which were written down in the ninth century, were written in a world that using the legends and history that people of that time would appreciate, and so that it inspired their imagination, and it's gone on and inspired sort of our collective you know world imaginations for 1,000 years since. So to set a story in that world also felt like kind of getting back in touch with that source.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And replay, of course, is the first thing I've done that's overtly historical. I mean, Last Express, of course, is also set in the days before the First World War, so it's about European history. But in replay, it's not fictionalized. I'm really telling the story of you know, like my grandfather's experience of the First World War, as a teenage soldier in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is actually, if you play Blast Express, you can see the parallels between his
Mm.
story and the backstories of certain of the characters on the train. And then my dad's childhood experience as a refugee in Nazi-occupied France, from age 7 to 10, before he emigrated to the U.S. So those family stories, which were told to me, I really wanted to tell them, in a book, in a graphic novel, and to tell them truthfully, as I didn't want to do the Hollywood version. I really wanted to, stay true to, what happened, what they remembered, and what they told me, and what I've been able to find out in my own research. And the same for my own life, talking about the episodes of game development with Karateka, Prince of Persia, the movie, The Last Express, that I kind of recount in comic form in the book. It was sort of like an extra pleasure for me was to kind of go back and remind myself of what the Apple IIs of the time really looked like, and what posters did I have,
Mm.
in my office at Broderbund, and draw the streets of the San Francisco and so forth, the way that they actually were at the time, and then to draw the streets also in the 1970s, and Vienna in the 1930s. I've just always really enjoyed that, and so to do it and to be able to actually hand draw each frame for a graphic novel was just a pleasure. I really really enjoyed making that book.
Well, I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. I highly recommend it to our listeners. It's, I mean, both for the game development stuff, but really just like you said, capturing these places and times, your own family history. I think, your family history kind of comes through to some degree in your career, I think, with the sort of history and sense of history that's in your work. And it's been a remarkable career so far. I hope we get even more. I'm kind of curious what might be next.
Oh, we'll have to do this again in a year.
Yes, please. Let's. Yeah, it's been an amazing conversation. I think you buttoned it up perfectly by talking about the book, and like Brett said, yeah, definitely everyone should check it out.
I should add that on my website at jordanmechner.com, if anyone's curious, you can find the books there. You can also find The Last Express and some of the behind-the-scenes stuff about Prince of Persia, Karateka, the journals, and some of these old, sketches, as well as my current sketchbooks that we've been talking about, and of course Replay. So they're all at jordanmechner.com.
Yeah, it's a great website. People should check it out. Especially your drawings that you have up there, and the quotes that you have kind of talking about them. So yeah, highly recommend it as well. Go out there and get the book, folks.
Thank you so much for spending some time with us, Jordan. This has been really a pleasure.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it.
Welcome back from the break. Every interview is wonderful, and this one is steeped in history, games that have a lot of connections, one of which we didn't even get to, remarkable career in Jordan Mechner.
Yeah. I didn't even mention it in his intro or when he was on air. I don't know, felt maybe like it would have put him on the spot, but he is the only connection that I can think of that I have on LinkedIn where his experience, I don't know if you've seen it, but his experience, where it just lists all of the companies you've worked at, etc. It literally, for him, it just says self-employed for 40 years. There's one entry. There's one entry, and it doesn't even list the games. It does, it's like obviously he has other posts and things, but it's like, well, that's not going to help me in the intro, so I got to go to other places.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, I mean, it's funny because he's so connected with Prince of Persia. I think most people think of him in that connection because it's such a long connection. It's it's the game that has seen a whole flourishing through multiple reboots, and
there's a new one out. Even
there's another one that's supposed to be quite good. That's a very kind of a Metroid-y kind of thing that we didn't get to either. I'm sure he consulted on it because he always does.
Yeah, he did.
Why, as we talked about with Assassin's Creed, it's why they went to Assassin's Creed, but there's still there's still love for that Prince of Persia, so we're going to keep doing some of that too. Just super fascinating guy. The whole thing about caricature is not a connection I had that had occurred to me. I mean, I read the graphic novel, so of course I have some of that from that because he does mention it, or the graphic memoir, I should say. But still, I don't think of it as important to the games, right? Even though he makes that connection there as well. Fantastic insights as far as the FMV era, and the constraints of we can do this much visually, but we still have this much limitations on RAM and access speed to the drives, and it's just great stuff.
Yeah, it's nuance that we talked a tiny bit about, but wouldn't have had the same perspective. I mean, I think we talked about it in the series, and it came out even in an interview a little bit. But I think both of us, not to speak for you, but both of us coming out of the series, I was just very, very surprised and blown away about The Last Express and just how big of a deal it ended up being. Not just for me playing it, but just looking back and then having him just now explain kind of the goals and the impact. And he's right. It's nice that, we know that it, at the time didn't do as well as he probably wanted monetarily, but its impact is still today, and it does still hold up. It's still very unique. There's not even anything else out like it. You know what I mean?
No, it's amazing. Yeah.
So I was just very surprised I was going into the series assuming Prince would be, the main focus. But for me, my most memorable, moments for the series was with the Last Express.
Oh yeah, I mean, it basically, I mean, after the sort of initial shock of finding your buddy's body and throwing him out the window, the first thing that happens is you go out into the hallway because what else are you going to do? And the conductor passes by you, or the ticket taker, or the porter, or whatever, whoever it is.
Uh-huh.
And it's instantaneously like one of the most memorable interactions you'll have in a game. And
Yeah.
it took, honestly, if I had played this at the time. I think it would have been until like maybe like The Last of Us, or God, Uncharted, to have like moments of connection between on-screen
Mm.
characters that landed as well as that did,
Yeah. Yeah.
and the amount of fidelity we had to get to to replicate that moment from 1993 later, or 93, right? Or was it 96? 96.
Yeah.
Whatever it was, was years. It was so
Yeah.
long,
Yeah.
before we could do it. I wish there had been additional games like it, because it's the sort of thing where I could definitely see myself playing more of it. But it's at that level of expense where you can't just like, it's like anybody can go and write a text adventure today if they want to, but you can't just go and make something like The Last Express, right? And that takes a real investment. Though, if anybody out there is looking to, please do and let me know.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
it's good. It's a good one.
Yeah. I do also recommend the Memoir. I've read some of his other. He did a graphic novel which I think he did the writing for a few years back, called Templar, still in his area of interest, or one of his areas of interest. I loved hearing him compare himself to, Hitchcock and Disney. Yeah, I just really couldn't get there when I was 6.
Yeah.
But computers came along. It's like, well, maybe I can catch up. It was like, wow.
Yeah, it's just a singular focus, right? Like knowing
Yeah.
what he wants, even from an early age. That's
Yeah.
a rare quality. And then actually committing to it and doing it for 40 years. It's like not only having a high bar and pursuing that bar, but actually succeeding in doing it time and time again, and still doing it, today. That's just a very rare thing.
Yeah, he is singular in some ways. Self-employed for 40 years kind of says it all. So
exactly, yeah. And then I think in getting ready, I didn't mention it in the intro either, but getting ready for that intro, I think that so he also wrote a Count of Monte Cristo graphic novel.
Oh yeah.
And the English version I think is coming out soon or something. Or maybe that's already out. So yeah. He's done many. I mean, if you look on the wiki, he's got many books that he's involved with. And again, there's a documentary as well. So yeah.
Yeah. It's about 30 minutes, I think. I looked it up too. Actually, back when we were
Chevet Ravine.
Yeah, exactly. Which is, I think, kind of where the Dodger Stadium is now. I think it's right above that the stadium is, to just sort of people kind of located it. Anyway, recommend basically anything Jordan's ever put his fingers on. Fantastic creative person. What a rich creative life to have, and I don't know, a real example to us all, for sure. And also, he took up drawing. Like, I feel such a kinship.
You got to work on your graphic novel now.
Yeah. Well, I've had thoughts. So, anyway, we also wanted to thank. You had somebody else you wanted to thank.
Yeah, Emily. I'll just mention her first name, but Emily is somebody that works with Jordan that basically helped us, coordinate this and get it going. And this was, as you might imagine, a long process because Jordan is busy, and so we finally got to it. But it was all due to Emily's hard work in making this happen. Because he actually, as you heard, was recording. I don't know. I think we mentioned it. He's recording from France. So
yeah, he's in Montpellier with former guest Michel Ancel. And Eric Chahi, who came up organically, but he is the other person whose rotoscope game we played. So it's a rich location there in the south of France, Montpellier.
Yeah,
Ubisoft
nice.
has an outpost there as well. So obviously, because that's where Michelle was working. So yeah, thanks to her. He has been out promoting the Memoir, which came out in English this year and was originally written in French, I believe, written and published in French. But yeah, totally recommend checking it out if you get a chance. All right, well, that is our show. We have not yet discussed what we're playing next, so I will not preview it. And we may also do some catching up. Next time is our 400th episode, I believe.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. I thought maybe it was this one, but yeah, we're there, huh?
Yep, we are. Maybe we should do something special. I haven't given it any thought.
I guess
maybe just push way for 500. What's 400 really?
Yeah. It's only another 100.
Yeah, another couple of years, no problem. Anyway, you can shoot us reviews. I get all the iOS ones. If you put them on something else, please let us know, point us at it, or even just send it in to the email at devgameclub@gmail.com. We're on the web at devgameclub.com, and my friend here has been twitching some of his own history games at twitch.tv/
Tim Longo Jr. with the JR at the end.
The history of the World of Ruin, of course, is what I'm talking about.
Yep, exactly. Yep. Sid has survived in this historical timeline.
Good for you. I don't think I did that.
Correct fish.
Yeah.
I don't know how anybody would have found that easily.
Yeah.
I had help, of course.
You had help from the folks on the Discord, which was my next mention. We have a Discord. We have other social stuff, but we have been weaning ourselves off of them and are going to be shutting them off entirely. So if you're hearing this sometime in the future and you go, to the Twitter or whatever, that may already be gone. So just so you know. Our intro and outro music was written and performed by Kirk Hamilton, commissioned by Friendly Cast and Aaron Evers, and our logo, the Discord, our merch store, all by Mark Garcia. Have fun writing your own graphic memoir this week, and good night.
Good night.